Good morning, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to a very important edition of Breaking News for this Saturday. It's the 25th day of October, 2025, and we have a very, very important story to share with you this morning in the headlines. We're only going to do this one story. It's written by Jonathan Tobin. He's the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, and the title of the story is Hamas, not Israel, is bound to blow up Trump's plan. And it's a summary basically of what's gone on in the past few weeks. It's what we've been saying here every day, and he puts it in just a fantastic way. So if you have someone who doesn't really realize what the situation's going on, this would be a good story to listen to today. And we've got the link there to the Jewish News Syndicate to read it because it lays it out perfectly what Israel is facing. Right now it's the Shabbat, the Sabbath, so everything's shut down in Israel. So we won't have anything till later today with respect to the latest stories from the country. But this one, again, summarizes what we've been saying, and it's important that you and I understand exactly what's going on and what the consequences may be. It's, again, let's get right into it. And I think this will help tremendously, everybody. All right, Hamas, not Israel, is bound to blow up Trump's plan. This is from the Jewish News Syndicate and Jonathan Tobin. Dubious comments expressing moral equivalence and trust in an international force to demilitarize Gaza are at odds with the president's tough talk about the terrorist. Two things can be true at the same time, he writes. U.S. President Donald Trump and his foreign policy team deserve enormous credit for brokering a ceasefire that achieved the release of the final 20 living hostages held by Hamas since October 7, 2023. It's also the case that much of what the administration is saying about implementing and maintaining the ceasefire is not merely unrealistic. It may actually be giving the Hamas terrorists the impression that they can get away without disarming or giving up control of Gaza and validating their claims that they have won the war they started 2 years ago. That's perfectly said. This is exactly the worry that we have. The Trump administration has been sending mixed messages about the situation in Gaza since the first stage of the ceasefire deal it brokered that was put into effect. On the one hand, the president, as well as his advisors, Mideast envoy Steve Witkoff and son-in-law Jared Kushner, have been taking some well-deserved victory laps since the hostages were released. On the other hand, there is a strong contrast between the threats being issued by Trump about what will happen if Hamas doesn't disarm and a lot of what Witkoff, Kushner, and Vice President J.D. Vance have said about the agreement to end the war. The upshot of all this is the growing perception that there is a rift between the United States and Israel about the next steps in Gaza. The two countries may be allies and have interests that are closely related, but as is always the case with any pair of sovereign nations, they are not identical. And again, this is the worry. As we sort out the various controversies that have arisen in the last weeks, the question we need to be asking right now are not about the undoubtedly good intentions of the Trump team or the resolve of the government of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to stay as close to the Americans as possible while also defending his country's national security. Rather, they surround the gaps between Washington and Jerusalem. And first of all, there's the expectation gap. It is neither criticism of Trump nor an attempt to diminish the praise he has justly received for the hostage release to point out that now that the live captives and more than half of the dead bodies have been returned to Israel, the gap between the other goals of the deal that they seek to accomplish of what is likely to follow in the coming weeks, months, and years in Gaza may be enormous. In other words, enormous problems for Israel's future. It's just as important to point out the unwillingness of the Trump team to honestly address the chasm between the expectations they have encouraged and the reality may be a source of real conflict between the U.S. and Israel. It's also possible that the situation in Gaza, now more or less, that the U.S. now more or less owns, will not only be a disaster, but will aid that element of Trump's coalition that is both isolationist and hostile to the Jewish state. And that's exactly what our worry is. It's not only a disaster about to appear on the horizon, but it could lead to isolationism again to Israel, just as we've been talking about. So, while the alliance is still rock solid and Israel's strategic position may be more secure than it's ever been, the extent of what could prove to be a looming post-war fiasco, and that's the perfect word I've been looking for, fiasco, in Gaza should not be underestimated. Far from being merely a complication in what is otherwise a brilliant piece of U.S. diplomacy, this situation could wind up bolstering the still marginal anti-Israel and anti-Semitic elements of the American right. And again, therein lies the worry. Some of the dissension between allies is, as Jewish News Syndicate's Ruthie Bloom, she's an excellent writer, by the way, on this website, has pointed out, doubtless the result of an effort by liberal media sources like the New York Times that invariably are hostile, they're always hostile to Israel. With its stories based on leaks from the White House, it's doing its best to foment tensions between the two governments at a time where they've actually been engaging in close and productive cooperation. And the next heading is myth and insults. Still, as much as the anti-Israel media's motives are more than suspect, they wouldn't be able to publish such stories without the help of some of those in the Trump camp who dislike the president's pro-Israel policies. And this is so true, as we've been mentioning. It's also accurate to note that some of the talk about the relationship from top figures like Witkoff and Vance have shown disturbing symptoms of moral equivalence between the two sides. And that is a great statement, and it's a real worry. It almost acts like there's a moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel. In other words, there's really no difference between them. Remember, we had the story. Witkoff said he's got in a situation where he's become very close to one of the Hamas negotiators. They've both lost sons, and so they've got this thing between them that is really meaningful. In other words, he's making it sound like these people are no different than Israel, and that is a sad thing. As much as friends of Israel have reason to be grateful to Witkoff and Kushner for their work in freeing the hostages, it's no good pretending that the framework they have created isn't rooted in mistaken notions about the nature of the conflict and fantasies about things that are highly unlikely ever to occur. I love this, Sam, what we've been saying. Again, all decent people may hope that Trump's vision of a Gaza free of Hamas and a ruled by entities, whether Palestinian Arabs or well-intentioned foreigners, dedicated to peace and rebuilding the Strip in a manner that will allow its inhabitants a better life, is realized. Everybody'd like to see that. Of course we would. But it's not too soon to point out that the chances of this happening, to understate the matter, are highly unlikely. What we've said are slim and none. And so it's exactly what's the case. The Times, the New York Times, as well as other newspapers, have covered the aftermath of the release of the hostages as if the main problem facing the U.S. in ensuring that the ceasefire holds is Netanyahu. The notion that Witkoff, Kushner, and then Vance have been engaged in babysitting to prevent the prime minister from wrecking their hard-won accomplishment is part of the conventional wisdom in Washington among the foreign policies establishment. Now we talk about Hamas's intentions. Yet the notion that Israel is the obstacle to implementing the peace deal isn't just wrong, it's completely disconnected from reality. It is, after all, Hamas, the party that is supposed to disarm and give up control of Gaza, which has been openly carrying out mass killing of Palestinians, those who see as political foes or dissidents. These actions make it crystal clear that the Islamist terrorists have no intention of relinquishing control of Gaza, and that they are using the current period to rebuild, rearm, and reestablish the terrorist state they ruled from 2007 to 2023. This is notwithstanding the fact that they are far weaker and in control of less territory as they were before they launched the orgy of mass murder, rape, and torture, kidnapping, and wanton destruction on October 7th that began the war. Here we go. Nevertheless, the messages coming from the U.S. remain mixed. Trump may keep saying the right things about obliterating the terrorists if they don't do as he says, but his envoys continue to make noises about the ceasefire holding nicely and that they believe their partners in Qatar and Turkey will help solve the problem. Even Trump seems to have swallowed the Kool-Aid about Qatar's being a good friend of the United States and a tireless worker for peace. This is in spite of the fact that the Gulf Emirate is largely responsible for enabling Hamas to start the war and also spreading Islamist propaganda via its Al Jazeera media outlet and by sponsoring and funding the Muslim Brotherhood. In other words, Qatar is just as responsible for this war as anybody else, but they're hailed as this great friend now of Israel and of the United States. And then we have the fantasy security force. So we talked about yesterday, remember? The above is troubling in and of itself. But even more disturbing is the way the U.S. team, and more particularly Vance, continues to speak of Hamas's disarmament being accomplished via an international security force, made up of contingents from various Muslim and Arab countries, but not Americans, and even to claim that the pro-Hamas United Nations might be involved in some way. One doesn't need to be a pessimist to observe that such a force being willing or being able or willing to take on Hamas is nothing more than a fantasy. Arab governments may dislike Hamas and wish to be rid of it, but the chances that any of them would actually take on the job themselves are about as close to zero as one can get. The same is true of any belief that a renewed flow of billions in foreign aid into Gaza will not be misused. The only ones who can deal with Hamas, and here's what we've said over and over again, are the Israeli Defense Forces. Yet, if as he has seemed to suggest at times, Trump gives the green light to Israel to finish off Hamas, that would not only end the ceasefire, it would effectively blow up the entire process that Witkoff and Kushner and the rest of the U.S. team have labored so hard to create. Israelis understandably dread the prospect of the war restarting and the casualties that the IDF would suffer from any campaign to eliminate the Hamas cadres that have benefited from the respite that the ceasefire has afforded them. But most understand that it may be necessary. Yet it would be despite Trump's tough talk. Despite Trump's tough talk, it would be a terrible blow to his administration's foreign policy objectives. Evident even with the best of wills on both sides of the U.S.-Israel relationship, it's going to cause problems, and it certainly will. It is why Hamas is betting that Washington will opt to let it stay where it is. That's Hamas stay in Gaza, rather than blow up Trump's signal achievement. In other words, remember what Kushner said, well, let's divide, Gaza, 50, not 50-50. Israel's got 58%, Hamas 42% work from there, like call it a day. All right. Either way, the tension over a renewed war or a failure to enforce the Trump's plan points out disarming Hamas and placing it in Gaza with what is likely to be an equally mythical government of an apolitical Palestinian technocrats is going to create problems for the United States. Israel's alliance won't be easily papered over. Among other things, will be fodder for those hitherto marginal elements on the right that are also growing louder with their resentments about Israel and Netanyahu. And we've talked about that. Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and others have been saying this is a bad deal. They shouldn't have signed it. Yeah, we're grateful the hostages have come back, but the long-term thing is going to be horrible for Israel. We'll be dealing more and more of that on our second program today about the fallout that's there. Okay, the final headline is faith in Trump. Those in both countries who value the alliance are going to have to place their faith in two factors. One is Netanyahu's good judgment in knowing how and when to say no to the Americans when it's necessary, an exercise in which he has been forced repeatedly to engage with friendly and unfriendly American governments over the past 3 decades. The other is Trump's good faith. There is every reason to believe that he means what he says about eliminating Hamas and being willing to support the use of force to do it. Though his political opponents have continually predicted that he would betray the Jewish state, he's done just the opposite over and over again during the course of his times in office, building a record as the most pro-Israel president ever sit in the White House. And we found 100% agree with that. Yet, here's the sad thing, just like in the first administration, too many of those who work for the president seem invested in fantasies about Hamas, the Palestinians, Qatar, and Turkey, rooted in naive beliefs about genocidal Islamists having the same hopes and dreams as Americans, Israelis, and the people of the West. They don't. That's an important sentence here. The naive belief that these genocidal Islamists have the same hopes and dreams as Americans, Israelis, and people in the West. They do not. And sooner or later, that dismal fact is going to blow up the peace plan that Trump is so proud of. When this happens, we need to hope that he and his foreign policy team are able to divest themselves of the same sort of foolish arrogance that characterized the beliefs of their predecessors in the Clinton, Obama, and Biden administrations about the Palestinians wanting peace and being willing to give up their country, give up their century-old war with the Jews. They're never going to give that up. As much as the hostage release should be celebrated, history doesn't end when they were liberated. And even an indomitable force like Donald Trump can't wish away the Palestinian desire to destroy Israel. Excellent article. Very well said. Jonathan Tobin from the Jewish News Syndicate. All right, here's what we have to say. As we stress, the situation is anything but rosy. Something has to give. What will it be? Because Israel has been put in an impossible position. Now, whatever takes place, they will get the blame, as Jonathan Tobin says, for ruining the peace plan. 2 signs from our book come to mind. 25 signs, we're near the end. Sign 7, there'll be a continual search for peace in Israel. And sign number 21, there'll be a rise in anti-Semitism. The entire world will be against Israel. We'll see more and more the lack of peace and the rise of anti-Semitism. No matter what they do, Israel cannot win. And we know from Scripture, things will only get worse. See our book, look up a timeline of 50 last days events. This also gives, what's going to take place in the future according to Scripture. All are free downloads from our website, Educating Our World, under the heading of Bible Prophecy. So this is where we're at right now. It's important that we all understand this and use this as our blueprint for how to move in the future, because these are the problems that are going to last days, weeks, months, and years because of what happened with this Gaza peace plan. All right, I'm Don Stewart. We will be back later with more stories on this Saturday. Until then, as always, may the Lord richly, richly bless.